Hi everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. This is a preview into one of many full-length tutorials available over on Patreon. As you can see, he's a lovely polar bear. This tutorial concentrates on not only the hidden tones that you get in light fur, but also how to create damp light fur. I've already created a dark grizzly bear, but that process was slightly different in terms of building up dark tones and clumps of damp fur. This is a slightly different method of building up the base. It's a little bit simpler, so it's quite a fun one to try if you are either novice or advanced. So you'll see here I've started off with the nose. I'm using my darkest black and I'm just starting to build up those darker areas. So obviously the nose itself is really nice and black, and then you've got these areas in the fur which are slightly darker. That's just where these clumps of fur are a little bit spaced out, so you can see more of that black skin underneath. So we basically want to start mapping these in initially, because that's what's going to provide us with a good map, and that means we can then build our hairs around those darker areas and start to really give the nose some shape. So as I do with all of my subjects, apart from really light fur, I start off with a really dark tone to begin with, and then it provides us with some really nice depth, and then we can start to lift areas and then add those nice hairs on top. With these lighter subjects, what you want to avoid is obviously the fur looking really washed out, not having too many tones, and the fur just looking really thin. So what you want to do is try and start off with this slightly darker base. So when you have a darker base, it means that you can start to layer your hairs up from medium gradually up to light. What you want to avoid is starting off with a base that is really bright. You look at this polar bear and you think, oh, should I start off with white? Because he is a very bright bear. But the problem with starting off with a base that's too light is once you start adding all of those light hairs on top to begin to make him look hairy, you're just going to have nothing underneath those light hairs to contrast against. So A, those light hairs are just not going to show up on a really bright base. And also B, your fur is going to look really boring. It's just going to have one or two tones in it. You want to start off with tones that are a little bit vibrant, have lots of color to them. And so that means when you start adding your light hairs in to lift the bear even more and add detail in, those light tones are going to be majority ivory, white, and really light grey tones. Basically tones that don't have much color to them. So when you get colors in slightly at the base stage, it means that you don't have to try and get them in at the hair stage. You've already got them in at the base stage. They're going to show through until the very end, and they're going to make the bear look nice and colorful. So you can see down the nose here, I've got plenty of browns and yellows in. So that's giving us that really nice warm golden glow that's hitting the nose there and around the eye. And then you'll see here I'm using a very light colored pastel pencil, but this still has beige hints to it. And that means I'm just starting to lift, but still keep a little bit of color in there so that when I start adding any white hairs in later to really lift, we're not going to wash the bear out too much. We've got lots of colors underneath to just pull that color out for us and just not make the bear look completely white and almost black and white basically. So if you've watched any of my previews before, you'll know that they are just a very short insight into my full length lessons. The full length ones, which are available over on Patreon, they are in real time, so not sped up, not skipped at all. So obviously with the previews here, I do speed through it to keep it nice and condensed for you. But it's an insight enough to hopefully show you my method. So obviously the base stage. So I start off with soft pastels and then I strengthen the base with pastel pencils where I can be a little bit more precise whilst also getting additional tones in. the more additional tones you can get into your animals, the more realistic they're going to look. And then I always finish off with my hair details. But before those final hair details, I do like to start with, I almost call it like a map. So I'll work in my first initial layer of my hair details quite roughly. These aren't the final hair details. They're just getting that lovely hair direction in and just starting to build up texture. So like with the amount of tones you add in, the amount of hairs you add in also plays a really big part in realism. The more you add in, the more realistic the animal is going to look. The fur is going to look lovely and dense and thick, which is always key to natural fur. So you'll see here with my soft pastels, this is a technique that I've recently started using in the last year. I'll use my soft pastels themselves as hair details, but really roughly, and you'll see this starts to map out these clumps, which are quite tricky to do. It's quite a daunting thing, wet and damp fur. I find the sooner you can start mapping these in at the base stage, the easier your life will be when you come to trying to finalize them. So if you start to get that shape in, you can see under the eye, above the eye, I've got these very, very rough, thick strokes that's starting to form these clumps. And then it's a very easy process to just add some details, some hairs on top, and they're still going to look really nice and clumped together, nice and damp. You don't want this fur to look dry, so this process is slightly different to what I would use for dry fur. Dry fur, I like to use really thin wispy hairs, quite fluffy hairs, whereas with this you do want to just clump them together. So having a slightly blunter lead is quite important for a bear like this where the fur is a bit more damp. I also like to work in my dark hair details quite a lot with fur like this, and this just stops you from lifting the bear too much too soon, and it keeps some nice depth in there. You can see in the picture the bear is not a brilliant white. There's lots of these grey hints going on, lots of shadows. So although we do want to work a lot of light areas in there, light fur, cream, we've got some very light greys in there as well. We do want to start off with quite a darker base like this. So around the nose, there's a lot of this golden light hitting, so lots of these ivory hairs in this section, and that's just keeping some nice colour in here. I've got some nice dark brown base underneath and some sort of medium beige tone as well, and that's just making this area look a lot browner, a lot more yellow than the area around the eye, which is a lot colder. So this tutorial is a brilliant one for anyone who struggles with your cold and warm hues in your animals, especially these lighter furred animals. So I'll teach you how to pick out these tones. So in the areas in the picture where they are slightly colder, identifying the areas that are warmer as well. One of my tips to basically deciding if an area is cold or warm, if you're not sure, I always say just pick an area which is really, really obviously warm or cold. So for example, if you look at the area in between the eyes, so the center of the forehead, you see that slightly brown line. It's quite short, that line. You'll see in the portrait I've marked that in with quite a dark brown tone. So that's an obviously warm area. If you're looking at another area and you're thinking, I don't know if that's warm or cold, compare it with that really brown area, which is warm. And if it looks completely different and a lot colder, then obviously it will be cold. If it looks similar and isn't clashing that much, then it will be warm in tone. So always compare with the obvious, and that should help you out a little bit. Another tip as well is take the photograph on your computer or your phone and hype up the contrast or the saturation. And what that does is it just pulls out all of those hidden tones and hidden temperature changes, and it makes them really, really obvious. It just really saturates them, and that will help you to pick those out as well. So just a couple of tricks, one of many in my tutorials. I have so many now in my library. It's really, really hard to choose between, which one's my favorite. People are always asking me if I could choose one, but there's just so many now that I adore, and there's so many ones that are great for just beginners, people who haven't even picked up pastel pencils before, but also people who have been doing it for ages. They just want to try something different, try a new style, and just elevate their work as well. So most of you who have watched my previews before will know a lot about my lessons in terms of they are in real time. They come with a materials list. They come with an outline, reference image, my artwork just to refer to, and of course an in-depth voiceover. And I'm always at hand as well to answer any questions. You can either message me on Patreon or comment on the post on Patreon. Another option, if you don't want to join Patreon, is you can buy this as a one-off. So Patreon is a subscription service, but it's very, very affordable. So you can join for as long as you want, as short as you want. If you do want to cancel, you just have to make sure you cancel by the start of the next month, so by the 1st, and then you won't be charged for the next month. But if you buy as a one-off, obviously you don't have to subscribe. You just contact me either via email or on social media if you have me, and just ask me for whatever lesson you want. It's all on my website in terms of the full library. And then you can pay via PayPal or bank transfer if you're UK based. And then I'll send you over all of the links and all of that information that you'll get on Patreon. It's a little bit more expensive than what you would pay on Patreon, because those links that I'll send you, you will have those for life. Whereas with Patreon, once you cancel your subscription, you cannot access those videos again. So it is a little bit dearer, but it's still very, very affordable. I have lots of people who use this option and they keep coming back for more, which is amazing. This tutorial, I use a mix of soft pastels and pastel pencils. So I used the Unison soft pastels for this smink as well. And then in terms of the pastel pencils themselves, I use Faber-Castell Pitt, Stabilo Carbothello, and Caran d'Ache. Now, I appreciate that not everyone can get hold of all of these different brands. You either have maybe just one or two brands, or you don't use soft pastels at all. That's absolutely fine. I do provide alternatives. All you need to do is just contact me and say, I don't have Unison, I have X instead, or I just don't want to use soft pastels. Can you give me a list of, Faber-Castell Pitt alternatives to Unison, for example? So don't be put off by the fact that you don't have every single material that I do and use for these lessons. It really is just a guide. I've been working in pastels now for so long. I've built up this wide range of different brands and soft pastels as well. They're my personal favorites, and I've really narrowed them down, and I know what works now for what animals and what type of fur. So it is very much just a guide. Obviously, if you want to just crack on and use all of the materials that I do, then that's great. But if not, that's honestly absolutely fine. And I know some people prefer some brands to other brands, and again, that is absolutely fine. So you'll see here I'm working a lot of ivory into the fur. The ivory from Stabilo 105 is a very light yellow tone. This is really important for the polar bear because we don't just want to use a white or cold greys. We do need to mix some warmth into the fur, particularly around the eye. You'll see lots of warm hints going on here. So for the base around the cheek, it is a little bit colder in tone, and there's a little bit of a shadow, a dip going on just around about here. So I'm just using a Payne's Grey from Faber-Castell 181. I'm just mapping in a little bit of shadow there. Sometimes if you don't have a specific color in a soft pastel, then you will just have to use your pastel pencil. It takes a little bit longer to cover the surface area, but it's absolutely fine to use pastel pencils as a base. So I'm using the same technique, just roughly working in these hair details here, and that's just starting to clump the fur together really nicely for us. So it just gives us some lovely texture in the fur, and because I have that darker base underneath, and you'll see I've got those warmer areas blocked in as well as those colder areas, it's just mapping out those different temperature changes within that quite large area of fur there. So you'll see I've left some slight gaps in the base there, just where I want a little bit of that shadow to show through a little bit more obviously. So using a mix of my really, really light beige tones, as well as this is a very cold light grey tone as well. So even as I lift my fur, I'm making sure I use a range of cold tones and warm tones as well. We want quite an even balance in this polar bear. There's not really one sort of dominating temperature. We've got quite an even mix of warm and cold, I would say. So we don't want to use too much of one and not the other, for example. Onto the ear, so nice and dark in the center, and then for the area around the ear, I'm going to use the same technique as I did for the face. So the fur here is also quite clumped. It's also very light, so I'm using a lot of light tones here, but still starting off with tones that have color to them, so we're not washing out that ear too soon. So lots of brown tones as well, especially on the edge of those darker areas. Really important with pastel, and actually all mediums, is when you're working on a dark area, especially ones that are next to really light fur, you always want to have what I call a bleed in between. So a really nice gradual transition. We don't want any dramatic tonal changes. So if you have a black right next to white, it's not going to look natural. You want a tone, or even a couple of tones if you can, in between the black and the white. And it's quite a good idea to make that tone quite vibrant. That just, especially when you're working with black and white, you do want quite a bit of color in there just to bring it to life a little bit, so it doesn't look monochrome basically. So I always put these medium mid-tones in between black and white, and it just makes sure they come together really, really nicely. So in the example of the ear, I've got black, and then I've got a burnt umber, which from Faber-Castell 280. That's a really dark brown tone. And then on the edge of that, I've used a lighter yellow tone. It's a Vista from Faber-Castell, which is number 179. And then we move into cream, and then we move into white. So it's a very, very gradual transition, nice and slow, so there's no dramatic changes that are really unnatural. So just starting to work some nice hair details in here. So the ear isn't particularly dark around the edge, so I am using more of a medium grey tone to start to build out a little bit of texture, just start to map in those clumps there. And then starting to lift with my ivory. Of course, this ear is a little bit warmer, just around the inner edge. Around the outer edge, it starts to get a little bit colder, especially on that bottom left edge. So I will be starting to layer with a slightly colder grey tone there later on. The white pastel pencil that I like to use in my lessons is the Stabilo Titanium White 100. This is brilliant for initial layers of white hairs, and then when you want to get a really bright punch on top of that for some nice final highlight, you can use a Chinese white from Caran d'Ache 901, although this is a tone that isn't that available to all countries, I don't think. So you can use a Faber-Castell white, which is just close enough in terms of its brightness. It's not quite as bright as the Caran d'Ache, but it's certainly brighter than the Stabilo one. So that's great for an extra pop of highlight. The Stabilo one, this one I'm using now, it is brilliant. It's just not quite bright enough, I find, to make areas really ping out. I always get comments about how I make my white fur look really bright, and that Caran d'Ache pastel pencil really does help. So always building up in the first kind of initial layers as much as I can with this titanium white from Stabilo, and then adding in the final pop with my Caran d'Ache one. So with these little clumps, I find to make them stand out even more, make them look three-dimensional, I give them a little outline with a darker pastel pencil. This is a dark sepia I'm using from Faber-Castell 175, and I just pick around them, and it just makes them stand out nicely. So down to the bottom of the neck now, just softening the soft pastel outwards here into the background. And then starting to work some hairs in. It's a little bit cooler in tone, you can see in the photograph at the bottom here. So I'm using a cold grey one from Faber-Castell, which is number 230. So lots and lots of lifting with my white pastel pencil. I go in with so many layers of my white hairs just to really make the white hairs pop out, those clumps, but also just to make the fur a lot denser and a lot hairier. So lots of ivory from Stabilo 105 to lift those slightly warmer areas. So under the ear here, I've used lots of warmer base. That's because the area is a lot warmer in tone. Down the bottom here as well, I also like to add warm tones slightly into colder areas and vice versa, a little bit of cold into warm. It just helps to balance areas out, and it makes sure there isn't a really dramatic stop and start between a warm area and a cold area. There's no dramatic changes going on in this polar bear. So instead of just ending a cold area abruptly and starting the warm, try and ease some warm hairs into your colder areas slightly, just into the border a little bit, and then do the same with the cold into the warm, and it just merges those areas really nice and naturally. So a bit more picking around some of these tufts here just to make them a little bit more obvious. And then onto the back of the neck. I'll leave you in peace to watch the last few minutes of this preview, as I have been rattling on for a little bit. But as I said before, this is a full-length tutorial. It's over 6 hours long. It's available on Patreon or as a one-off, and everything's talked through. The voiceover is very in-depth, and obviously if you have any questions along the way, you can absolutely ask me. Thank you so much for watching this preview. I really hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget, I have heaps of other ones available on my YouTube channel. So just go to my page and take a look through. And if you have any questions, you can leave them in the comment box below. Thank you so much for watching, and hope to see you soon on my Patreon channel or in my inbox.